Thank you very much, Senator Cardin. And what I would like to remind for our panels, we've got some wonderful witnesses here today for our panel and for our audience today. We will have a series of votes beginning at 3:30 p.m. So I will apologize ahead of time. We will be coordinating to move back and forth to the floor of the U.S. Senate. But if we need to, we may have to take just a short recess to accommodate any movement. But again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. So we are going to go ahead and start with our first panel. And thank you, Mr. Rivera, for being here. James Rivera is the Associate Administrator in the Office of Disaster Assistance of the U.S. Small Business Administration here in Washington, D.C. Prior to this position, Rivera served as Deputy Associate Administrator of the Office of Disaster Assistance, improving the agency's disaster operations after Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. He has worked in the Office of Disaster Assistance since 1994. Rivera received his Bachelor of Business Administration degree in Finance and Economics from Texas Tech University. Thank you again, Mr. Rivera, for being here today. We'll go ahead, if you would please, we'll listen to your opening statements.
Thank you, Senator Ernst and Ranking Member Cardin, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the agency's current federal disaster efforts in the Midwest as well as other areas in the country. Let me start by saying how much we appreciate the support you have provided the agency and our disaster program. Over the years, you've been very responsive to our findings and staffing needs, and we are thankful for the working relationship with the committee and the leadership you provide. I also want to share how proud I am of the men and women in the SBA's Office of Disaster Assistance. They're a dedicated group, work very hard year-round to help disaster survivors in time of need. Working with our federal partners and state emergency management agencies, SBA is on the ground soon after the weather events to begin assessing damage. In coordination with your governor, SBA will help determine if appropriate factors might exist for federal disaster declarations. Ultimately, requests for federal disaster declarations are initiated by the governor's office and fall into one of two categories. A major declaration is submitted to and approved by the President and involves federal agencies including FEMA, SBA, and HUD. An agency or SBA declaration would involve only SBA resources and is approved by the SBA administrator. To give you a sense of scale, in fiscal year 2018, SBA responded to a total of 13 major presidential declarations and 35 agency declarations. So far in fiscal 2019, SBA has responded to 13 presidential major declarations and 34 agency declarations. We have current disaster declarations in Iowa, Oklahoma, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. In addition, we continue to provide disaster loan assistance to survivors from Hurricane Florence in South Carolina and Hurricane Michael in Florida. Senator Ernst, in your hometown, in your home state of Iowa, we continue to serve disaster survivors of severe flooding and have so far approved over 300 loans for over $27 million. We will continue to keep you informed of our efforts, and we hope you will continue to call on us if we can be helpful in any way. Just last week, our acting administrator had the opportunity to visit with Governor Reynolds to provide her an update on our activity. We made the same offer to her to please reach out if we can help answer questions, clarify loan status, or simply help disaster survivors to the right contact. A large part of our success in providing disaster loan assistance to survivors are the improvements we've made in processing and approving loans. Since 2005, we've greatly reduced our cycle times to a current average of 8 days for home loans and 12 days for businesses. In Iowa right now, those numbers are slightly lower, with 7 days for homes and 10 days for businesses. We also just spent a lot of time expanding our preparedness efforts. Just last week, we conducted a conference for agency personnel involving media training. Additionally, we continue to focus on outreach plans for working with local, state, and federal officials, as well as our resource partners. We have focused staff efforts this year on interagency coordination, and on Monday, we conducted a conference call with all the governors' offices to refresh them on our role and to share our points of contact. In my almost 30 years of working at SBA, most of it's been in the disaster program. I've learned that every disaster event is unique. The agency has come a long way, and we've made numerous improvements to address the challenges we face in every disaster. The SBA team will continue to be there for disaster survivors, and we hope you will continue to call on us when disaster events impact your state. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify and for your ongoing support.
Thank you very much. I really do appreciate that, and I would like to echo what Ranking Member Cardin had said as well during the Ellicott City flooding, that you saw SBA there right away, and I would say that with the flooding in Southwest Iowa, SBA was there right away as well. So I do appreciate that. We'll go ahead and start our round of questions for you, Mr. Rivera. I'll go ahead and start, and then we'll pass it off to Senator Cardin. To receive SBA disaster assistance, folks must go through a pretty convoluted process. At least that's the way it seems to the folks back home. For example, I've received feedback that many disaster victims are unaware that you have to be denied by FEMA in order to receive the SBA assistance. And what can we do to better educate the folks that are going through a very stressful time to make sure they understand what that process is?
Thank you for the question. Convoluted is not the word I like to use. We like to use the word streamlined. We refer everybody to FEMA, disasterassistance.gov. From every administration I've worked for, the face of presidential declarations is FEMA. Mm-hmm. So if you go through the disasterassistance.gov portal, when you register with FEMA, what we've done from a streamlining perspective, 30 of those data points, when they get referred to SB, actually get transferred. So the disaster survivor, when they're filling out our application, they don't have to go through that same process with those 30 data points from that perspective. We continue to work closely with FEMA. We're trying to make the process as simple as possible, but that's the current process that we're currently working through. But we continue to try to maximize any sort of efficiencies we can get with FEMA to the SBA process.
Okay, so would it be fair to just simply say then everything needs to start with FEMA? Everything needs to start with FEMA.
So we're covered by the disaster recovery framework, the broad interagency coordination between 25 federal state agencies. So the first point of contact is disaster assistance. What a lot of disaster survivors don't realize that they may not be eligible for SBA assistance on the front end. So FEMA will filter out those individuals, and we'll refer them to their unmet needs program, which is another FEMA program. So we've tried to simplify the process from that perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. And on a similar note, what we have heard from folks in going through some of these disaster loans, there have been improvements, and you did mention some lower days to actually get those disaster loans. And there have been improvements on the issue by moving to things like desktop verifications, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that, versus the on-the-ground inspections. We know that more progress is always needed. If there's a way that we can assist with that, we want to do that. I've heard from some folks who have been flooded out of their homes and attempted to purchase other homes in the community using SBA financing, but they were unable to meet closing dates because of certain SBA delays. So what can SBA and Congress do to ensure that the folks are receiving their assistance in a timelier manner? So while they may be approved, there are certain delays.
If I can start back with Katrina Rita Wilma, I know 2005 is a long time ago. We used to take every disaster survivor through the entire experience. And up front, we knew a lot of these individuals wouldn't qualify for a loan, but we went ahead and put them through the credit score, the verification process, the full processing, and that's why it took us 74 days to process a home loan back then. Since we've actually started streamlining the processes, we know up front that individuals with a lower credit score will not qualify for an SBA loan. That's approximately 30% that we call get automatically declined. Okay. We experienced, if I can take you to 2012 during Superstorm Sandy, where it took us 10 days on average to get a loss verifier, one of our staff, on the ground to do a physical inspection on the ground. So since that period of time, we started doing this during Harvey, Irma, and Maria. We actually do a desktop verification. So what we get is similar to a footprint of a realty.com that shows the home or the business. And we have Marshall Swift standards that can say, based on 3 feet of water, you cut sheetrock up to 4 feet, so forth and so on. And we can estimate what it costs to repair or replace that home or that business. So that actually cut 5 days off of our processing time. We continue to have these rigorous internal controls in place to make sure that we are not jeopardizing any taxpayer funds from that perspective. But those are a couple of examples that we've used over the years that has accelerated the processing times.
Okay, and you said that the process now, we're down to 8 days in Iowa for homes?
Yes, ma'am. We're running
that
7 days for homes and about 10, 11 days for businesses. And I always caution everybody that will listen to me. Our goal is 2 to 3 weeks, just based on volume. We don't really know how much volume we're going to get, but we're able to successfully get most applications out in that 10-day time frame.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I appreciate that, and thanks for moving to that desktop verification. That sounds like it's helped. Yeah, I appreciate it. Ranking Member Cardin. We'll start with our questions now, Senator Cardin and I. So, would you say you were going to grill them? Is that okay? Okay. Well, and this is for the entire panel. But according to FEMA, roughly 40 to 60% of small businesses never reopen their doors following a disaster. I believe that Ranking Member Cardin had mentioned something to that effect. And what are some of the obstacles that prevent businesses from reopening after a disaster, even if if they're finding the services you have to offer? What stops them from reopening? And maybe, Mr. Barnes, you might be able to speak to that first. What were some of the obstacles that you faced?
Financing was first. That was the biggest thing. I only had 2 months previously to opening, my shop. I put everything in to buy the company. I was sitting with like maybe $500. Financing was the biggest problem. There was a good chance by September I wasn't going to be able to reopen. Everything was just gone. On top of that, it's just clean up, getting the, everything up and running, moving forward. But financing was the number one, and luckily, with our Ellicott City, that wasn't as much of a problem. There was a lot of options available from the DHCD to SBA that people could tap into depending on what happened. So we had a 90% success rate, but even after 18, a lot more shut down because it just got harder to, sustain.
Okay. And then Ms. Shimkat, now Jason was able to get back on his feet utilizing some of these different programs and tools. So what barriers would folks face where they would not be able to receive assistance through those programs and reopen their businesses?
Some of the barriers that we've seen is specifically even with a flood, it just keeps happening. And with the inability to know when the end is and to try to recover, that you lose hope when you do all this cleanup, you spend this money of your own money to clean up because you can't wait many times. The inventory could get ruined. You need to make sure that you're also providing for your employees. So the cleanup and then the rural aspect. In many of those rural, Hamburg, Pacific Junction, you had folks that lost their homes. Their employees lost their homes. And those were the folks that were also buying from those local small businesses, the mom and pop shows, those Main Street businesses. And the third part, as I clean up rural, and then to the employees, we have a very low unemployment in the state, which is a great thing, but it also can be a barrier as well for these small businesses. When the Missouri went over its banks and we lost Interstate 29, we lost Highway 34, we lost a lot of employees. There are a lot of employees that go across the state there where maybe they worked in one and lived in another. What we run into then is the commute time goes from 5 minutes to an hour and a half. And maybe in larger communities, on the coast, or, that's not a big deal. But it is when they can find another job close to where they are for about the same pay with a 5-minute commute. So they struggle then as well, keeping those employees. Those are some of the challenges.
Understand. And so then they would make that choice not to reopen their business and perhaps seek other employment elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Barnes, did you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think some sometimes we tend to start from the time that the disaster happens and look at all the things that are going to make it challenging for the business to come back and reopen, when what we really need to do is take a step back and look at sort of the situation with small businesses. First of all, most of the small businesses in this country are tiny. They're under 20 employees or 10 employees or less. And they're particularly vulnerable to disasters because they have small profit margins, they lack revenue diversity, and they cannot sustain extended business interruption. Small businesses lack adaptive business management models, and I want to be very careful about that because I think small businesses are really incredible in terms of adapting as neighborhoods change and things change over time. But when there's a catastrophic event and something happens, it's particularly hard to immediately adapt your business model when you don't know who's coming back, what customers are going to be around, and that sort of thing. They tend to be uninsured, and they tend to depend on generating revenues from customers and clients who've also been impacted by the businesses. All of these things are amplified then when there's a disaster. And so starting the process of recovery from the time of the disaster is almost too late. Because what we really need to be thinking about is how do we help them prior to the disaster, really build that capacity in anticipation that there probably will be a market shock or a disaster at some point.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. I'm out of time, but I think we'll have time to bounce back and forth. Senator Cardin.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Barnes, you define the odds. First, to survive a flood, being in business for such a short period of time, not having any cash to deal with that, not knowing what to do next because you had never thought you would have to go through this. You were still on a learning curve being a business owner, and then 20 months later to go through a second experience. But in the second experience, you already understood how to keep a business open because you went through it the first time. And it seems to me that the SBDC, the Small Business Development Center, really was your lifesaver, really was your lifeline to understand how you could stay in business. And that was exactly what we intended when we passed the RISE Act, to have help on the ground that understood the community and had the confidence of the community that could be there on a continuing basis. So I really do appreciate your courage. And I was on the ground and saw the devastation, and I must tell you, the courage of the shop owners on Main Street are unbelievable, because it was a frightening situation after the first, and the second was worse than the first. So, good work.
Thank you.
Mrs. Barnes, you're reinforcing Senator Howley's point about grants, which is interesting, that we hadn't really given that a lot of attention because SBA doesn't have the capacity right now to deal with how they would deal with grants. But it's something we should consider since there are grants available through HUD. And that takes a long time, and it doesn't really work to keep you in business. So it's an area that we do have a gap that we really need to concentrate on. You did mention, though, the CDFIs. How could we enhance their ability to help us in a disaster?
Well, CDFIs are a very interesting organization, and I do want to also broaden it to the idea of community banks and community development credit unions, because I believe that there are a lot of organizations that are on the ground that have the capacity to make financial transactions. That's what they do. That can be activated if they are incentivized to do so. I worked for a CDFI after 9/11 and after Katrina. And what we were able to do as an organization was pull together resources. So we identified the federal resources that were available, we looked to philanthropy, and we really started to put together a comprehensive program, which is really, I think, that what is most needed, where you have grants, loans, technical assistance, and such. And in New Orleans, after Katrina, we relied on the SBDC to partner with us. So we operated a program for fishermen, and we had a fisheries assistance center. We had the SBDC sitting in our office doing intake with the fishermen. We actually, by the time of the BP oil spill, SBA was sitting in our office as well, because we we talked to SBA and we said, with vulnerable populations, and this is the thing that CDFIs know about, they know about their community and they know about the population in their community, so they know how to think about the services. And so basically, we were able to sort of aggregate all these services under one roof. Everybody had different resources that they were using, right? We weren't necessarily pooling resources, but we were able, through the smart intake of the SBDCs and then referrals that we were able to make to other resources, grants that we had through HUD CDBG, we were able to really activate a very strong program.
I think Mr. Barnes would agree that the partnerships that were available in Howard County, in Ellicott City, the county exec was incredibly open to all the county resources, that you had the reinforcement of community organizations, you had neighbors helping neighbors, all that was coordinated through the county and state with the federal partners, and it made a real difference with the confidence level to get back into business. So,
Oh, yeah, the 2016 flood was, the difference between 2016 and 18, 18 took the wind out of a lot of stuff, but definitely the 16, that all the resources and everything was set up, and it made a huge difference. That Howard County is, I always said, was the petri dish of how to survive a flood the best way possible. Between the SBDC, the SBA, FEMA was there. I mean, the disaster center was just a wealth of knowledge and resources to get everyone back up and running. I think after the 16 flood, they had a 90% retention rate, so that's huge. And I think only 2 businesses went under completely.
right. So a couple relocated, but you're correct. It was a very high percentage that stayed in business after the flood.
Yeah, almost unheard of numbers for after a disaster.
Thank you.
Yes, and Ms. Shimkamp, we've had a good discussion about the partnerships that exist out there, and from you, I know that the work that you and your colleagues at the Iowa SBDC have done in helping Iowans recover. I've heard a lot of those stories, and as you and our other panelists have pointed out, the SBDC counselors, they're not only serving as mentors to those that are going through a very stressful experience and helping them in navigating government resources, but you're also the volunteers on the ground that are helping those small businesses actually clean up their properties, whatever needs to be done. We know that you work in tandem with SBA and their disaster field office. Can you go ahead and walk us through your work together and what resources, if any, SBA does provide to you to aid communities with their disaster recovery?
Absolutely. When a disaster happens, and every disaster is a little different. Let's say a tornado. When a tornado comes through, the first thing we do is we get one of our folks over there immediately on site with the local people. And in Iowa, we are already partnering with everyone, so many times it's a quick phone call right after an event happens so we can get started. In this most recent instance, it was a great example of they reached out to us. We already were there. We were reaching out to all the economic developers, and they said, where should we locate? Help us get those names. And I thought that was excellent because we were able to get them where the core offices need to be, where, hey, here are some ideas. Here are some people to reach out to immediately. That was very beneficial. When the head of Disaster Operations West, Tanya Garfield, came to town the first time, she reached out or had her team reach out, and they said, we need to get together. Why don't you come with us as we tour as well? And then we could add, hey, here are some things we're running into, and then they could also be that arm to get those services immediately where they needed to go. I was very impressed. I was around in 2008 as we were just kind of starting down the road of some of these things. So I've seen a huge difference in what is working. I know that puts more pressure on them, the timetable to get things more quickly. The other part is they were also in constant contact. They also made sure that they were available at every town hall meeting. And if there was somebody that maybe was upset, I instantly got a phone call from their lead person here in the state and said, hey, get somebody over to this person right away. Let us know how we can help. So that was another way, too. One of the questions you asked earlier of SBA was, how can we get the information out? Sometimes people may not be ready to hear when the disaster is so overwhelming. And by repeating the message and repeating, here's who's available, that's key. And then also having all of the partners understand there's no silos here. Hey, you know what? You're the one that can help them better. Let's get you over there. That's been very, very beneficial, that we can really reach out quickly and handle problems efficiently.
That's very good and very helpful. And I appreciate that. It's important that we're sharing that word back and forth between various agencies and communities to make sure that we're getting the right people to the right organizations.
Absolutely.
So thank you. I'm going to focus just a little bit on our farmers, and we do have some great farmers in Maryland as well. In your testimony, Ms. Shimkat, you discussed that designated disaster accounted for 9.2% of the total U.S. market value of agricultural products in 2017. Can you provide insight on how our farmers are recovering, and how can Congress assist to expedite that recovery?
Absolutely. It was one thing, if I may add, when I first started bringing up that the ag and the business side are interconnected, people were a little confused at first. But when we started, I reached out to Secretary Neg, and some of the flood damage, 1.9 million bushels of corn lost, 482,000 bushels of soybeans lost, and that's just what we have so far. We have the bins that, as the moisture got into those bins and the bins expanded, the corn expanded, and all of that lost. So you're looking at the 2018 crops that were in the bins lost. 2019, many of them haven't gotten in the fields. So now the 2019 crop is lost, and if we can't get the debris cleaned out of those fields, the 2020 is going to be lost. So helping with the lost grain that was stored is tremendous. Also, being able to look at the cleanup side, and if there are recovery loans, that they more so fit what traditional loans for the agricultural industry are. They're the seasonal side. Here's when they are given. Here's when we can follow up with them. As far as the payments, deferred payments, and then also some of the things that we're looking at is you have many of the business owners are also farmers at the same time, and looking at if there could be, tax deductions or tax credits when it comes to disaster that can be applied to current or even over extended period of time future tax years as well.
No, that's fantastic information, because oftentimes we don't think about the farmers. We think about businesses and Main Street, right. But we have to understand there are other types of businesses that exist out there, farming being one of those. Senator Cardin.
I'm going to sort of wrap up for this because we do have some votes that are on right now. I want to thank all three of you. Ms. Barnes, I want to just underscore the point you said about adaptation and resiliency. I think that's very important, that before there's a disaster, you get as much preparation as possible, including flood insurance and information about that. So as we look at information that's made available through the SBA, generally, there should be more preparation for the unexpected, because unfortunately it happens. And so I think that was a good point, and I think it's something else that we need to take a look at as we move towards the reauthorization of these programs. But I want to thank all three of you for your testimony, and we really do look forward to strengthening these tools, and we're proud of the work that's done at the SBA.
Yeah, thank you so much, and Ranking Member Cardin, and I do appreciate our distinguished panel for being here today and sharing your experiences and your expertise. It's imperative that this committee stays focused on making sure that the Small Business Administration is supporting small businesses and our individuals in a timely and efficient manner as they recover after the devastation of a disaster. So the hearing record will stay open for 2 weeks, and any statements or questions for the record should be submitted by Wednesday, July 3rd at 5 p.m. Again, our thanks to the panelists, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.